Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to jump into, some pretty interesting research about how we can improve the way we extract metals, especially focusing on copper, making the whole process, more efficient, more sustainable, and definitely a lot less taxing on the environment. And it's no secret, right?
Yeah.
The world is moving towards renewables. We need electric cars, batteries, all that good stuff. And copper is like the backbone of all that, right? We can't do it without copper. But the problem is the way we traditionally get copper out of the ground creates tons of waste, literally mountains of it. So researchers are constantly looking for smarter solutions, right? Solutions that make the whole process more efficient and a lot friendlier to the planet. And that's exactly what today's paper dives into.
That's exactly right. The paper is titled Novel Reagent Addition Method for Improved Copper Recovery by Forbes and colleagues, published in 2025. And what really drew me to this paper is the way they're tackling this fundamental challenge in mineral processing, how to get more copper out of the ore, especially when you're dealing with those big, coarse particles.
Yeah.
And so, in this deep dive, we're going to break it all down. We'll get into the details of this new method, understand the chemistry behind it, and discuss why this could be a huge step towards making mining more efficient and sustainable, particularly for those coarser particles that have always been a bit of a pain point for the industry.
Right, like a bottleneck.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with the problem this paper is trying to solve. It sounds like the conventional approach we use, this thing called flotation, has some serious limitations when it comes to dealing with those bigger, coarser particles.
Right.
What's the main issue there?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. The paper really highlights that traditional flotation doesn't do so well with coarser particles, these larger grains in the ore. To get good recovery, the typical way to do it, the industry standard, is to grind the ore down to a very fine powder, almost like talcum powder consistency.
Yeah.
But grinding that finely has a couple of drawbacks, a couple of big problems. First off, when you grind everything down so finely, you end up losing some of the valuable minerals that are still trapped within those coarser particles.
Oh, I see. So it's like they're still kind of locked in there, but they're not being released effectively because the particles are too big.
Precisely. Those coarser particles don't float as effectively as those fine particles do.
Right.
And the second problem is even bigger. It takes a massive amount of energy to grind all that rock down so finely. I'm talking about a significant portion of the energy used in industrial processes worldwide.
Wow.
It's a huge energy sink. And then, of course, you have to deal with all that fine material, those tailings, which can be a real headache to manage.
Yeah, like the environmental concerns with those big tailings dams we hear about all the time.
Exactly. It's an issue for water retention, stability of those dams, and potential environmental impact.
Okay, so lots of downsides to grinding everything super fine. Now, the paper talks about fluidized bed flotation as a technology that's specifically designed to handle these coarser particles, and they mention the size range of 180 to 850 micrometers.
Right.
Can you give us a quick overview of how fluidized bed flotation works? What's the basic principle there?
Sure. Picture this. Imagine a tall column, okay? And at the bottom of this column, we have a bed of those mineral particles. Now, water is being pumped upwards through this bed.
Okay.
And the flow of water is strong enough to lift the particles, so they're not just sitting there on the bottom. They're kind of suspended, moving around almost like a fluid.
Oh, interesting.
And from the bottom, we introduce air bubbles. So now we have the particles suspended, and we have these air bubbles rising up through the bed. And here's the key. The valuable copper particles in the ore, which have been treated with chemicals to make them water repellent, they'll attach to these rising air bubbles.
Okay.
So those copper-laden bubbles float up to the top of the column where they can be collected. Meanwhile, the waste minerals, what we call the gangue, they stay behind in the fluidized bed.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of like a separation process, but instead of using mechanical stirring like in those traditional flotation tanks, we're using this upward flow of water and air bubbles to get those copper particles moving up and away from the waste.
Exactly. It's a different approach to achieving that separation, and it can be particularly advantageous when working with coarser particles.
Fascinating. So this paper isn't just looking at fluidized bed flotation as a whole.
Right.
They're specifically zeroing in on how we can improve the chemistry within this technology. And that brings us to collector reagents, which sound pretty crucial. Can you break down what a collector reagent is, in simple terms for those of us who aren't chemists? And why is the way we add it such a big deal?
Okay, so collector reagents. Think of them like little molecular magnets.
Okay.
We introduce these collectors into the mixture of ore and water, what we call the slurry. And their job is to selectively attach to the copper minerals, making them hydrophobic.
Hydrophobic meaning they hate water, right? They want to get away from the water.
Exactly. And that's what we want, because those air bubbles we talked about, they're not water-friendly either. So the collector coats the copper minerals, makes them hydrophobic, and then they're naturally attracted to the air bubbles.
Right, like those tiny magnets are helping the copper latch onto the bubbles and hitch a ride to the top.
Exactly. Now, the traditional way of doing this is to just add the collector directly into the slurry before we start the flotation process. The collector dissolves in the water, mixes around, and eventually finds its way to the copper mineral surfaces and attaches. This is what the paper calls preconditioning in solution. But this research explores a completely different approach, which they call aerosol collector addition.
Okay.
Instead of dissolving the collector in the water beforehand, they create a fine mist of the collector solution, like an aerosol.
Okay.
And they inject this aerosol directly into the airflow that's being pumped into the flotation system.
Interesting.
So instead of the collector being delivered through the water, it's being delivered directly to the mineral surfaces by those air bubbles themselves.
That's a really clever idea. It's like changing the delivery system for the collector.
Exactly. It's a fundamental shift in how that collector interacts with the mineral particles.
Now, the paper makes a big point of comparing these two methods, the traditional preconditioning and the new aerosol approach. What was the main finding, the key difference they observed?
The most exciting finding is that they saw a significant improvement in how much copper they could recover when they used the aerosol method. And this was particularly true for those larger, coarser particles that fluidized bed flotation is designed for.
So it's like the aerosol method is really good at targeting and collecting those bigger particles that are normally a challenge.
Precisely. And here's the other really important part. This increase in copper recovery didn't come at the expense of purity. They weren't just floating everything up together. The process remained selective, meaning they were still getting a high concentration of copper in the concentrate, and they were leaving most of the waste minerals behind.
That's great news. So they were able to get more copper out, and it was still high-quality copper.
Oh, exactly.
That sounds promising. Okay, let's get into the specifics of how they actually carried out these experiments. Can you walk us through the reagents they used and the kind of ore they were working with?
Sure. For the collector, they used a very common and widely used collector for copper sulfide minerals called sodium isobutyl xanthate, or SEVIX for short.
Okay.
And to create those all-important stable air bubbles, they used a frother, a chemical that helps those bubbles form and last longer.
Okay.
The specific froth that they used was methyl isobutyl carbonyl, or MIBC. Now, the water they used wasn't just plain water. They actually went to the trouble of formulating a water solution that mimicked the water chemistry at a real mine site, Mount Isa Mines in Australia. This meant adding specific salts like potassium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium sulfate, and sodium carbonate in specific concentrations.
Oh, interesting. So they weren't just using distilled water or tap water. They were trying to create a more realistic water environment that reflected what you'd actually find in a real mining operation.
Precisely. They wanted to make sure their results were as relevant to real-world conditions as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the ore itself? Where did they get the rock sample for these tests?
The ore sample came from Triton Copper Operations, and it had a copper grade of 1.24%, which means that for every 100 kilograms of ore, you'd get about 1.24 kilograms of copper.
Okay.
The main copper-bearing mineral in this ore was chalcopyrite, which is a copper iron sulfide. And the main gangue minerals, the unwanted stuff, were pyrite, which is an iron sulfide, and quartz, which is silicon dioxide.
All right, so they had their chemicals, they had their ore sample. How do they prepare the ore for these different flotation experiments? Did they just crush it up and throw it in?
Not quite. They actually prepared the ore in two different ways, depending on whether they were doing conventional flotation or fluidized bed flotation, because these two methods typically work with different particle sizes.
Okay.
For the fluidized bed tests, they took the ore and crushed it down to a coarser size. Then they screened it to get particles within a specific range, from 180 micrometers to 850 micrometers.
Okay.
And to make sure everything was evenly distributed, they homogenized this material, kind of like mixing it really well. And then, importantly, they also conditioned it. This involved stirring it very rapidly at a high solids concentration for about 5 minutes. This conditioning step is important for cleaning and refreshing the surfaces of the minerals, making them more receptive to the flotation process.
Right, so it's kind of like prepping the ore, getting those mineral surfaces ready for action.
Exactly. Now, for the conventional flotation tests, they took a portion of the same ore, but they ground it down much finer. The target was to get about half of the particles to pass through a sieve with openings of just 75 micrometers. That's the typical fineness you'd aim for in conventional copper flotation.
Wow, so significantly smaller particles for the conventional flotation tests.
Right.
Okay, so they've got their ore prep. Let's talk about the flotation systems themselves. You mentioned they used both conventional and fluidized bed setups. What did those look like in the lab?
Okay, so for conventional flotation, they used a pretty standard piece of equipment, a 3-liter laboratory flotation cell. They filled this cell with the slurry, the mix of ground ore and water, and the solids content was about 26.7% solids.
Right.
The pH, which is a measure of how acidic or basic the solution is, was left at its natural level, which is around 8.1 for this ore. They added the frother, MIBC, at a concentration of 23 parts per million. Now, before they actually started the flotation process, they agitated the slurry in the cell at a high speed for 4 minutes. This is like mixing everything up really well and making sure the collector and frother have a chance to distribute throughout the slurry. Then, for the flotation itself, they slowed down the stirring and started pumping air into the cell at a rate of 3.6 liters per minute.
Okay.
As the air bubbles rose through the slurry, they collected the froth that formed at the top, what we call the concentrate, and they took samples of this concentrate at 3 different time intervals: 1 minute, 4 minutes, and 15 minutes.
So they were basically tracking how much copper was being recovered over time.
Exactly. Now, for the fluidized bed flotation, things looked a bit different. They used a special piece of equipment called a JKHF Mini, a laboratory-scale fluidized bed flotation column.
Okay.
In this column, they pumped water upwards through the bed of ore particles at a rate of 4 liters per minute. This upward flow of water keeps those particles suspended, creating that fluidized bed effect we talked about earlier. Right. And from the bottom of the column, they introduce air bubbles at a much slower rate, 0.4 liters per minute. Just like in the conventional tests, they added the frother, MIBC, at 23 parts per million, but this time they added it directly into the fluidizing water stream. And just like with the conventional tests, they collected 3 samples of the concentrate over time.
Okay, so 2 very different ways of setting up the flotation process. One using mechanical stirring, the other using this upward flow of water and air. Now, how did they actually implement those 2 different collector addition methods, the standard preconditioning and the new aerosol method, in these 2 setups?
Okay, so for the conventional method, whether they were doing conventional flotation or the preconditioning step for the fluidized bed, it was pretty straightforward. They simply added the collector, SIBX, directly into the slurry at the very beginning before they started any agitation or aeration.
Okay.
This way, the collector had time to dissolve in the water and start attaching to those mineral surfaces as the slurry was being mixed.
So it's kind of like pre-soaking the ore with the collector?
Exactly. Now, for the aerosol method, they took a different approach. They first dissolved this SIBX collector in water, just like with the preconditioning, but then they used a nebulizer.
A nebulizer, like what you'd use for asthma medication.
Exactly, that kind of nebulizer.
Okay.
So they used the nebulizer to create a fine mist, an aerosol, of the collector solution. And this aerosol was then injected directly into the airstream that was feeding into the flotation system.
So the collector was being delivered to the minerals through the air bubbles themselves, not through the water.
Exactly. It's a very different way of getting that collector to interact with those mineral surfaces.
Right. Now, the paper also delves into how they measured the amount of collector used, the dosage, and they point out that comparing this across different flotation systems isn't always as simple as it might seem. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. You see, in the mining industry, we usually talk about collector dosage in terms of grams of collector per ton of ore, or grams per ton, written as Gedana. But the researchers point out that when you're comparing different flotation systems, this Gaten measure can be a bit misleading from a scientific perspective, especially because different systems might use different amounts of water relative to the amount of ore they're processing.
Right.
So a more direct way to compare the chemical environment those minerals are exposed to, and that's really what matters, is to look at the actual concentration of the collector in the water, which is usually measured in parts per million, or ppm.
I see. So it's like, even if you're adding the same amount of collector per ton of ore, if one system uses a lot more water, the actual concentration of the collector in the water will be lower.
Precisely.
And that can affect how well it attaches to those mineral surfaces.
Exactly. So in their conventional flotation tests, they use a Cybex concentration of 0.36 ppm, which worked out to be 1 Granton. But for the fluidized bed tests, they went with a much higher Cybex concentration, 5 ppm.
Okay.
Now, that 5 ppm worked out to be 3.3 grams for the preconditioning stage, where they were mixing the collector in a smaller vessel.
Yeah.
But for the aerosol addition in the fluidized bed column, because they were continuously flowing water through the system, that same 5 ppm concentration translated to a much higher Granton value, 308 Granton.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah, and the researchers emphasized that they kept that solution concentration consistent at 5 ppm for both the preconditioning and aerosol tests in the fluidized bed, because they really wanted to isolate and compare the effect of the delivery method itself.
That makes sense. It's like they were controlling for the chemical environment to see if the way the collector was delivered actually made a difference.
Exactly.
Okay, last question on the methods. How did they analyze the results? What were the key things they were measuring to determine which method was better?
The most important thing they were looking at was how much copper they recovered.
Okay.
Both the overall recovery and how much copper was recovered in different size fractions. They also measured selectivity, which tells us how well they were able to separate the copper minerals for the waste minerals. They specifically looked at how much silicon from the quartz and iron from the pyrite ended up in the concentrate along with the copper.
So they were checking to see if the increased copper recovery was coming at the cost of also bringing in more of those unwanted minerals?
Exactly.
Okay. They've set up their experiments. They've tested those two collector addition methods in both types of flotation, and they've got their data on copper recovery and selectivity. What did they find? Let's start with the conventional flotation tests.
Sure. One of the first things that stood out in the conventional flotation tests was that this particular ore had a surprisingly high natural floatability.
Natural floatability?
Yeah, even without adding any collector at all, they managed to recover over 50% of the copper.
Wow. So it was already pretty easy to float.
Yeah, it was surprisingly floatable on its own. So that's an important baseline to keep in mind.
Okay.
Then, when they added a small dose of collector, 0.36 ppm, they didn't see a big boost in the overall copper recovery. And it didn't really matter whether they used the conventional preconditioning or the aerosol addition, the overall recovery was pretty similar.
So at that low dosage, the delivery method didn't really matter much in terms of the total amount of copper they were able to extract?
Right. And the same was true for the selectivity. At that low collector concentration, there wasn't a significant difference in how well the copper was separated from the silicon and iron, regardless of how they added the collector.
Okay, so it sounds like at that low dosage in the conventional flotation setup, the delivery method of the collector didn't really make a noticeable difference in the overall results. But the paper did mention that they analyzed the recovery based on the size of the particles. What did that analysis reveal?
Right. So when they broke down the results and looked at how much copper was recovered from different size fractions, they found that for the very finest particles, those smaller than 38 micrometers, the aerosol method actually did make a difference. For those fine particles, they recovered about 20% more copper with the aerosol method compared to not using any collector at all, and about 10% more compared to using the traditional preconditioning method.
Interesting.
Now, for the larger particles, the difference wasn't as big.
Okay.
And the researchers suggested that this might be because, in a conventional flotation setup, those coarser particles weren't being recovered as effectively in the first place, regardless of how the collector was added.
Right.
So it was harder to see a significant difference for those larger sizes.
Okay, so even in conventional flotation, there was a hint that the aerosol method might be more effective, at least for those super fine particles.
Right.
Now let's switch gears and talk about the results from the fluidized bed flotation experiments. Remember, they were using much coarser material in those tests.
Yes, exactly. The particle sizes were much larger in the fluidized bed tests, ranging from 180 to 850 micrometers.
Right.
And they were also using that higher collector solution concentration of 5 ppm. And what they found was pretty interesting. Even with those large particles, they still saw a decent amount of natural floatability.
Really?
Yeah, without adding any collector at all. They recovered over 40% of the copper just by using the fluidized bed system.
That's pretty impressive considering how big those particles were.
Yeah, it suggests that the fluidized bed is inherently better at recovering coarser particles compared to conventional flotation.
Okay.
Now, when they added the collector using the preconditioning method in the fluidized bed, they did see a faster initial recovery of copper, but that advantage didn't last.
Okay.
The final copper recovery was only about 52%, which is just 10% higher than what they got with no collector at all.
So the preconditioning method and the fluidized bed didn't give them a huge improvement.
No, not really. But when they switched to the aerosol method for adding the collector, that's when things got really interesting. They saw consistently higher copper recoveries throughout the entire experiment, and ultimately they recovered about 70% of the copper using the aerosol method in the fluidized bed.
Wow, so going from 52% to 70% just by changing how they added the collector in the fluidized bed, that's a huge difference.
It is.
What about the selectivity in these tests? Did that big jump in copper recovery come at the expense of also recovering more of the unwanted minerals, the silicon and iron?
That's the key question, right?
Yeah.
And the good news is that it didn't seem to. When they looked at the silicon, they found that while the fluidized bed generally recovered more silicon compared to conventional flotation, probably because it's better at capturing those larger mixed particles, the aerosol method didn't make that worse.
Okay.
It was pretty much the same as when they didn't use any collector at all in the fluidized bed.
So the aerosol method wasn't sacrificing selectivity against silicon?
Right. Now, when they looked at the iron, things were a bit more nuanced. They found that the preconditioning method did increase the amount of iron recovered, and it also shifted the overall balance towards recovering more iron relative to copper.
So the preconditioning might have been making the pyrite more floatable.
That's what the researchers suggest, yeah. It seems like the preconditioning step might have been activating the pyrite.
Okay.
But with the aerosol method, while they also recovered more iron, the selectivity trend was closer to the test with no collector at all. So it seems like that extra iron they recovered with the aerosol method was probably more due to the fact that they were recovering more of those mixed particles, those particles containing both copper and iron minerals, rather than the iron mineral itself becoming more floatable.
Okay, so the aerosol method in the fluidized bed might have even been slightly better at keeping the iron out compared to preconditioning.
Yeah, it's possible.
All right, so they analyzed the overall recovery and selectivity. Did they also break down the fluidized bed results based on the size of the particles, like they did with the conventional flotation data? I'd imagine that's particularly relevant since fluidized beds are designed for coarser material.
They did, and those results were really telling. They divided the concentrate from the fluidized bed flotation tests into 4 different size ranges, from the smallest, 150 to 212 micrometers, up to the largest, 425 to 850 micrometers.
Okay.
And the first thing they noticed was that the particles in the concentrate tended to be coarser when they added collector, especially with the aerosol method.
So the aerosol method was better at capturing and floating those larger particles.
Exactly. And when they looked at how much copper was recovered in each of those size fractions, the differences were really striking. The aerosol method consistently gave much higher copper recoveries compared to the preconditioning method, and the difference became even more pronounced as the particle size increased. For those largest particles, those 425 to 850 micrometer particles, the aerosol method recovered about 50% of the copper, while the preconditioning method only recovered around 21%.
Wow, so they essentially doubled the copper recovery for those really large particles just by using the aerosol method.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic improvement.
That really highlights how effective the aerosol method is for handling coarser material. Okay, stepping back and looking at the big picture now, considering all these results, what are the major implications of this research for the field of mineral processing and flotation in general? What are the big takeaways?
Well, I think this research has several important implications. The fact that they were able to significantly boost copper recovery, especially for those coarser particles, and that they did it without sacrificing selectivity, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
It means that we might be able to reduce the amount of grinding we need to do.
Right, because if we can effectively recover copper from larger particles, we don't have to grind everything down so finely.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for energy consumption.
Yeah, remember we talked about how much energy goes into grinding.
Exactly. So this could lead to significant energy savings in the mining industry.
That's a big win for sustainability.
Absolutely. Another implication is that we could recover more copper overall.
Right, because we're not losing as much copper in those coarser particles that traditionally wouldn't float as well.
Exactly. And the fact that the aerosol method seems to favor the recovery of those coarser particles, it also means that the tailings, the waste material, will be coarser as well.
And why is that a good thing?
Coarser tailings are generally easier and safer to manage. They tend to settle better, they hold less water, and they're less prone to some of the environmental issues associated with fine tailings, like dust. and the potential for those tailings dams to fail.
So it could lead to more sustainable ways of managing mining waste.
Exactly. And the paper even hints that implementing this aerosol method might not require a complete overhaul of existing mining infrastructure.
That's good news.
Yeah, they suggest that it could potentially be done with relatively minor modifications.
Like what kind of modifications?
Well, in the lab, they just used a simple nebulizer to create the aerosol and inject it into the airline. Scaling that up to an industrial level would likely involve installing similar nebulizer systems on the airlines that feed the flotation cells or columns.
So it's not like they have to completely redesign the entire flotation process.
Right. It seems like it could be a relatively straightforward retrofit.
It really feels like this research is hitting all the right notes, addressing those core challenges of growing demand for metals, reducing the environmental footprint of mining, and making the process more sustainable.
I agree. It's a step in the right direction.
Now, the paper also delves into some nuances about how we should be thinking about and comparing those collector dosages.
Yeah, they make a strong argument that using the concentration of the collector in the solution, those ppm values, is a more accurate and scientifically meaningful way to compare results, especially when you're dealing with different flotation systems that might use different amounts of water.
Right, because it's that concentration that dictates how much collector is actually available to interact with those mineral surfaces.
Exactly. And they also touch on the fact that while the aerosol method might use more collector overall in a continuous industrial setting, they suggest that recycling the water used in the fluidized bed could help to mitigate that.
Oh, so it's not like we'd need a massive increase in collector production if we switch to this method?
Right. And they even suggest that maybe, in some cases, we might not even need to do that preconditioning step at all when using the aerosol method.
So we could potentially simplify the process even further.
Yeah, it's an interesting possibility.
All right, so to sum it all up, what would you say is the main takeaway from our deep dive into this research on aerosol collector addition? What's the key message here?
I think the key message is that this approach of introducing collector reagents as a fine mist, an aerosol, directly into the airstream, has huge potential for improving mineral recovery, especially for those larger, coarser particles. And they demonstrated this clearly in the context of fluidized bed flotation.
Right.
They showed a big increase in the amount of copper recovered without compromising the selectivity, without accidentally recovering a lot of those waste minerals.
And this could have really exciting implications for making the mining industry more sustainable, right? Less energy consumption, potentially less waste, and maybe even safer ways to manage the tailings.
Precisely. It's about rethinking how we do things, coming up with more efficient and environmentally friendly ways to get those metals out of the ground.
So, as we wrap up our discussion here, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder based on this research?
Well, this study focused on a new way to add collector reagents in flotation.
Right.
But it made me think about a broader question. Are there other stages in the whole mineral processing chain, beyond just flotation, that could benefit from a similar rethinking of how we add those essential chemical reagents?
Interesting.
Could this concept of targeted delivery, maybe using aerosols or other innovative methods, be applied to improve other parts of the metal extraction process, make those steps more efficient and sustainable as well?
Yeah, it's like opening up a whole new avenue for innovation in the mining industry.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can always look for smarter, cleaner, and more effective ways to get the materials we need for a sustainable future.
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
My pleasure.